The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Resilience Partnerships and Coordinated Planning, I'm Ruby Woodside and I'm joined by my co-host today, Ned Gardner, who's the Engagement Manager for the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit.
Hi everyone, I'll be joining you toward the end of the webinar when we do questions and answers.
Great, next slide. So today is the last in a series of 3 webinars that Second Nature is co-hosting with the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. During the first webinar, we had an introduction to the Climate Resilience Toolkit, and we talked about how that can be a resource for campuses. And then a couple of weeks ago, we talked about assessing the financial risk of climate change, and we also heard from California State University, Long Beach. So if you're interested in these webinars, the recordings are posted on our website. Next slide. So the agenda for today, we have 2 speakers. We have Tina Woolston, who's the Sustainability Program Director at Tufts University, and Taya Kinshu, who's the coordinator for an initiative called Climate Resilience at Urban Campuses and Communities, or CROCS, and she's at Portland State University. So today, first of all, I'll just give a brief introduction and a little bit of context, and then Tina will talk about the work that Tufts has been doing with resilience planning and how they've been coordinating that with other planning on campus and with the city of Medford. And then after Tina, Taya will discuss Portland State University's work with different community partners and how some of that work is informing the institution's resilience strategies. And then at the end, Ned will facilitate a question and answer session. So we should have plenty of time for a discussion here, so please submit any questions you have during the webinar. You can enter the questions at any time through the chat box on your screen. Next slide. So just a very brief recap of what we talked about earlier in this series. In the first webinar, Ned introduced the 5 steps to resilience from the Climate Resilience Toolkit, and we talked about how these align with Second Nature's framework for resilience planning. For more information on these 5 steps, you can visit the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit online, and I definitely recommend that campuses check that out. There's a lot of resources that can help you through your resilience planning and through implementing the climate commitment. Next slide. So then last week we heard from a company called the Climate Service that works on quantifying the financial risk of climate change. So we introduced a framework for how schools can measure the potential financial impact of climate change and how schools can use it as an opportunity to really drive some decision making on campus. Next slide. And then also last week, we heard from California State University, Long Beach, which is really leading the way in terms of working with the community on climate action and integrating resilience planning into different aspects of the campus, including curriculum and strategic planning. Next slide. So again, if you're interested in these webinars, the recordings are posted on Second Nature's website. But for today, I'll turn it over now to Tina Woolston from Tufts University. And just as a reminder to folks on the line, you can enter questions for the Q&A at any point during the webinar, and we'll try to make sure that we get to them at the end. We should have plenty of time to do so. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tina.
Thank you, Ruby. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you can go to the next slide. So Tufts University, as many of you might know, is a compilation of a bunch of different schools located mainly in the Boston area. We have a large main campus in the Medford-Somerville area near Boston. It's sort of a suburban urban campus that has undergraduates and graduate students. It has residential buildings. It has a lot of faculty, a lot of small wood frame houses. Anyways, it's a complicated campus. Then we have a smaller campus in Boston. We have a little tiny campus for the School for the Museum of Fine Arts in Fenway. And then we have a larger health sciences campus in the Chinatown region that has all graduate students, all professional students, and only 11 buildings. And it's much smaller, it's more vertical, easier to manage. And then we have a lovely rural campus in Grafton that has a small amount of students, but a lot of space. So next slide. So when we were looking, this all started, my climate resilience story all started with a risk registry. So several years ago, Tufts was creating a risk registry and a heat map of risks. And when I saw that, I was like, how can I get climate change onto that risk registry? Because it's a risk, it's a real risk to the university, and the board of trustees sees this. So I did a little investigation, and I learned that both operations and the Department of Public and Environmental Safety had risk metrics that were sort of assigned to them. The operations one was related to energy and the price of energy, and also mentioned greenhouse gases, but the Department of Public and Environmental Safety had one that was sort of related to emergencies and weather events. And so I was investigating a little bit more, and I found out that the Department of Public Environmental Safety had a sub-department on emergency management that does a THERA every year, which is a threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. And then usually they use the THERA to create a hazard mitigation plan. And then this is something that they submit to FEMA, and that allows them to be eligible to get funding in the case of a disaster. So I found out that it wasn't up for renewal yet, so I just bided my time until it came up for renewal. And when it did come up, I got myself on the RFP committee and the subsequent project committee, and helped get climate change included in the RFP, and also was able to help select a team with extensive knowledge and experience in climate change adaptation planning. So the same team that completed the THERA, you can sort of see it over on the right, it says GADS. It's from the University of Southern Tennessee. They completed the hazard mitigation plan and submitted it to FEMA to comply with the Disaster Mitigation Act. Next slide. So this report, it's about the hazard mitigation plan that's shown there. It's over 500 pages. It's this huge report. It's actually really great. It explains what is in one of these reports, et cetera. And the most important thing is, for every hazard in our report, there's a little section, you can see one shown here, that explains the impacts of climate change on that particular risk or hazard. So for example, the one that I've shown here is a little clip talking about one of the risks that was identified was earthquakes. And so there's actually a little thing that explains how climate change might impact earthquakes. And so that sort of carries through the whole hazard mitigation plan, is this little note being and this is what we're going to expect in the future. And that apparently is pretty unusual. Next slide. So each campus, and I'm just showing you the one for the Medford-Somerville campus, got this list of hazards on the left, and then they did a risk assessment they have a formula that looks at the probability of an event happening, impact that it would have, et cetera, and then the vulnerability. And then they use that to calculate an overall risk number. So you can see that the top risk for this campus were extreme temperatures, flooding from extreme precipitation, infectious diseases, mid-latitude cyclones, which are the official name for hurricanes, and severe winter weather. Next slide. So this happened, and then I got an email from a friend of mine who works, I met her as part of her job, but she is the energy manager for the city of Medford, which is one of our host cities. And we already had an existing relationship, and we were invited to participate in a community resilience building workshop that they were doing for the city of Medford in March of this year. And there was actually a Tufts graduate student helping to organize it. And Medford was working in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy to run a community resilience building workshop using funds from the Governor Baker's administration. So you can see I put that up on the left-hand side of the slide, where the Massachusetts administration was spending $1 million to fund climate vulnerability preparedness in 71 communities. And so Medford got, I think it was around $24,000 to do this workshop. So I rounded up my new friend, the emergency manager, and we went to the event and got to see how it worked. There was people from all over the Medford administration. There was facilities managers, there was the utilities were there, there was community partners, such as at my table, there was a chaplain from a church, there was community activists, it was really interesting about how many different people they had there. So we met Adam Welchel from the Nature Conservancy, who was facilitating the workshop, and he sort of came up and expressed interest in doing a similar event at Tufts, since both he and Second Nature, Ruby, were interested in exploring the application of this model to institutions of higher education. Next slide. So I had this experience, and then I brought the idea to the Sustainability Council Steering Committee, who thought, like, I was super surprised. I was like, so there's this group that wants to do it for us. And they were like, that sounds great, we should do it. And I was like, really? Like, really? So one of the committee members on that steering committee is a professor who teaches a climate change class where students have to do projects. And so she helped solicit some students to work with me to organize the workshop as their class project. Next slide. So we took the top 4 risks identified in the Hazard Mitigation Plan, modified them just a little bit. So we, for example, we combined hurricanes and severe winter storms, and called them hurricanes and nor'easters. And then instead of just focusing on extreme temperature, we focused on extreme heat. And then we worked with Adam from the Nature Conservancy to organize a gathering of people from all across Tufts during one of the busiest times for them, May 3rd, which is actually the day before finals here. But, the students were, because we had students involved, they had to finish the project before finals. And so we were able to sort of use that to get people. And then my boss, the executive vice president, she helped imbue like the expectation that people would go to this. So that I think really helped. Next slide. So we had a really great representation, and I include this. The next page actually has like a list of the departments, but I include this because the colors kind of give you a sense for the representation we had. So we had people from the surrounding communities. So the light orange on top shows, people from Somerville and Medford. It was mainly the sustainability managers, but some other folks from within the town also RSVP'd. We had people from capital projects and campus planning. We had people from dining, people from facilities, safety, TU, like the police department. We had undergraduates. We had we had graduate students, and we had some folks who supported research. And then we had the sort of brick colored orangey red on there is like people just from a whole range of offices. So the legal department, the chaplaincy, the TTS is our IT department, the provost. I actually had someone find out about this from the art gallery and call me up and say, can I participate? Because where our gallery is actually at risk for flooding. And we were actually really concerned about this weather that we're having. I would really like to participate. Next slide. So here's like the official list that you can look at your leisure of the different departments that participated. We also had someone from the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency come. And that was possible because my compatriot here in the emergency manager at Tufts, like he has relationships with all the emergency managers, in the state and in the towns. And so he was able to pull in those people. And then I knew tons of people at Tufts that like he didn't know. So we were able to work together to pull in all these different departments. And next slide, the last slide. So we use this workshop guide that the Nature the Conservancy created, and you can get it off communityresiliencebuilding.org. It was really great, and it has a standard chart. That maybe can't take care of themselves. So that was a big issue that came up. And then people were obviously concerned about some of the actual physical infrastructure, such as our boilers, our dependency on utilities for refrigeration, for food and medicine, our building, we have some very old buildings, we have vulnerable trees, we have all sorts of chemicals being stored on campus and a lot of runoff, surface runoff. So what do we do with the stormwater? And one of the things that came up really strongly was people are really concerned about how are we going to feed people if the power goes out, for example, and we don't have backup generators at the dining hall, etc. So, and then transportation, information, IT, pretty much it ran the gamut of what people were concerned about, and especially was related to events, like people, that's very natural for people to want to talk about like an extreme weather event. So people were thinking in terms of that. But there was conversations around infectious diseases and what do you do if there's, if we have more prevalent infectious diseases, and how do you have business continuity if it's communicable, if it's infectious. And so like, do we need to bolster our IT or our management training so that people can work from home, or classes could be led remotely. So then we created a summary report. I don't have a picture of it, but where we organize the suggestions by both functional area and by priority. So in the workshop, the participants were asked to prioritize these hazards or risks, and so we had them listed by priority, but then we also pulled apart all of the suggestions and organized them by functional area. So it's like theoretically you could give the section on dining to the dining department, and they wouldn't have to sort of sort through a laundry list of 72 suggestions that may or may not apply to them. And then this document was sort of designed to be a snapshot, like to accurately represent what was discussed there. So we didn't throw anything out. But then we have a follow-up document that is a spreadsheet that basically takes all that information and puts it in one place. So you have the hazard list, and then you have the priority, and you have the functional area, and then we did an evaluation of like, is this something that's a good idea that people suggested? Is it something that we're already doing? Is it something that requires further study, or maybe isn't such a great idea? And then we also were able to identify so this was me and the emergency manager doing this. We were able to identify, well, we don't actually know. This is a good question. We don't know whether anyone's doing that, so we need to go ask this person or that person. And then that's the document that we're going to use to show our operations vice president and executive vice president about, okay, well, here's the things that we think we should focus on. Then we're also hoping to do the similar workshops in our Boston campuses. Like, we'll probably have one for both those campuses, and then one in our Grafton campus at our veterinary school. And I just wanted to mention there might be some resistance to this. I just talked to someone today who was like really worried about basically additional unfunded mandates from the other campuses. But I'm hoping that I can overcome that by explaining that this doesn't necessarily add another project to their plate, but rather it gives people like a new frame of reference to look at the things they're already doing. So if you have a health department that already has like an infectious disease protocol, but sort of knows in the back of their mind that it has to be updated, like this might be sort of like the extra bit of information they need to like be like, oh yeah, let's put that on our list for this year. It also, the co-benefits of resilience projects can help decision makers choose between two top priority items. For example, on this campus, the Medford-Somerville campus, when Tufts was considering whether or not to build, to replace the central energy plant, they had to choose like what kind of engine they were going to have to generate steam. And the idea that if we build if we get a cogeneration, combined heat and power plant, then we will be more resilient, was the thing that sort of popped that idea over the edge and able to basically unlock a little extra money to buy that version of energy versus the other one, because we knew if we had a cogeneration plant, then if the power grid went down, we would still be able to power a large percentage of our buildings, or at least the really important buildings. So that's the argument I'm hoping to make with my colleagues out in Grafton, is that this isn't adding necessarily anything new, but it's really helping maybe get everybody thinking about this in their everyday work. So that's all I have to say, and I'll pass it over to Taya.
Taya, I think you're muted. You unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry about that. Here you go. I was pressing the button and nothing was happening, but here we are. So thank you so much, Tina. That's a really, really great exercise. I'm really glad that you had some great outcomes for that. I'm really excited to see where that goes. So hi, everyone. My name is Taya Kinshu, and I am an assistant planner for climate resilience with Portland State University. So today I'll be talking to you a bit about our climate resilience planning process here at Portland State so far. I'll be focusing specifically on a collaborative partnership and demonstration project that came out of Second Nature's Climate Resilient Urban Campuses and Communities, or CREX grant, over the last year. So we'll be doing more broad engagement, workshop style engagement as we develop and prioritize our resilience strategies over the next year. And this presentation will be an example of narrow but deep engagement we did with one local organization in particular to really develop some strong community tethers and include community experts and the implementers of our strategies in our resilience planning process. So I'll be mentioning a number of tools and organizations throughout my presentation, so please submit questions as we go, and I'll be happy to provide further detail during the Q&A. So next slide. So at Portland State, we started out following Second Nature's Resilience Planning Framework, which recommends beginning the planning process with a resilience assessment to identify the strengths of your institution, who the tethers in your community could be for this work, and to begin to strategize on how best to leverage those assets, those university assets, what your strengths are for mutual resilience building within the broader community. Portland State is a large research university in the middle of downtown Portland, Oregon, and has always sought to be a helpful and effective resource for the surrounding community. Our slogan is "Let knowledge serve the city." We kind of tend to be kind of a test bed, a pilot ground for figuring out, how to partner, how to leverage those university resources. Our goals with this process were to build upon this reputation by making our asset inventory a useful community resource that really builds up the organizations we're partnering with to develop it. So we wanted our assessment to lay the foundation for developing our strategies. And we also wanted to kind of start establishing these synergistic relationships and really usable tools in the process. So we set about developing an interactive community asset inventory application, which is really centered on the needs of those community members in Portland, particularly around Portland State, with the highest vulnerability and highest exposure to climate effects. It's really kind of focusing on the social vulnerability piece as our primary target for some of these initial tools and initial organizations that we wanted to work with. And we wanted to build the capacity of our community organization that is already of a community organization that is already effectively serving these vulnerable and high exposure populations. And we wanted to harness university assets to facilitate this process, kind of leverage, what role we could be playing in our broader community. And again, we wanted to create a tool that academics and practitioners, so can use, as well as those that the most vulnerable people in particular, and those looking to serve the organizations serving our most vulnerable. So next slide. So as a university, obviously our students are a major asset. The educational, the knowledge-seeking environment, the university environment ideally incubates these brilliant minds to develop meaningful, useful, relevant applications. And we got really, really lucky in this on this project. So the students we were working with were operating actually as an unaffiliated collective of geographers and urban planners, and their convictions were based around meaningful community support, open data, and sharing the narratives of those underrepresented in data projects, historically and currently. So Tim Hitchens and Sachi Arakawa of the Mapping Action Collective really served as the backbone to this whole project, channeling their convictions and earnestness into a project that would really build both their skills as students and individuals and their own professional development while maintaining their values at the forefront of this work. So kind of another example of these co-benefits that we were looking for all along the way. So next slide. So our partner organization was Street Roots, which is a well-established Portland organization that advocates for community members experiencing houselessness and extreme poverty throughout the Portland area. They do this through both a newspaper vendor program as well as producing the Rose City Resource, which is a hard copy booklet that lists social services in the Portland area. So it's anything from emergency dental care to food boxes to severe weather shelters, safe spaces for youth, all sorts of things like that. Street Roots is working directly with the communities experiencing this highest exposure to climate effects. That's their main clientele, that's whose needs they're focused on, that's who they're working directly with, that's what the work that they're doing needs to be most effective for. So we really wanted to partner with them to kind of use their inventory of community resources as kind of the first step for our community asset map inventory that we're going to be continuing to develop. So we figured if we could map this booklet, it's a hard copy booklet, it fits in your pocket, again, exactly what the folks that they're working directly with would find most useful. But there's no digital version of it. So that means, there's not a really comprehensive look of, social service distribution in the Portland area, of, a network for these organizations to find other organizations doing the same work that they're doing that they could maybe collaborate with or streamline some of these processes to make them more effective. We didn't have like a look of like what parts of Portland don't have these services and could really use them. And so from a number of different sources, folks were asking for a digital inventory of these organizations. And so we were just going to digitize the Rose City Resource. But what we ended up needing to do was actually develop a whole data management workflow in order for them to maintain this resource in a way that could be accessed by those folks that want to use it for a variety of applications. And that workflow would need to be maintainable, intuitive, and within the existing capacity of Street Roots. So we had these asks for them. We had these things that we really needed and we wanted, and a lot of folks were coming at us from a bunch of different angles asking for, and we really just had to, we're really excited to just sit down with Street Roots, talk about our intentions, talk about where we're coming from, talk about, these potential mutual benefits, really do a lot of troubleshooting about, why they wouldn't want to be involved, why, this would be overcapacity for them, all these different sorts of things, and really just kind of put the time in to be adaptive, to be flexible, and to be responsive to the needs of this organization first. Put their needs first, build their capacity first, and then kind of meet our needs through our own work kind of on the back end. So so together with the Mapping Action Collective, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how we could access the data, how it could be regularly updated and maintained, and how we could achieve this while growing the capacity of Street Roots and not taking up too much of it. And so through this data management workflow, the resource will be maintained and regularly updated according to Street Roots' discretion, right? So really kind of maintaining their ownership of this resource as they know the community they're serving better than anyone else. And then that inventory will be digitally available and maintained at data standards that would be usable for a broader array of folks. So kind of meeting those needs of both sides. We painstakingly structure their data line by line so that we can develop a mapping application, which will be coming out in the fall. We're very excited about that. And worked with Street Roots every step of the way to make sure everything we were doing was something that they would be willing and interested in working with and maintaining moving forward. So Street Roots has now used our system for their round of updates, and thankfully they rated the workflow a 9 out of 10, which was great to hear, and said that it will make the process easier and more manageable in the long run. And even though this took way more time than we had anticipated at the get-go, being able to take our assets and offer them to these organizations doing the work that needed to be done meant that we created something that will be used, maintained, and accurate. And we definitely encountered hesitations along the way, but the relationship we took the time to establish meant that they trusted us enough and were in control enough not to just be satisfied, but excited about the product that we developed together. So next slide. So another asset that emerged during this process, extremely fortuitously, was the Northwest Open Data Exchange. So this is a data hosting platform developed out of PSU's Institute for Metropolitan Studies, which we are going to be using to share the digitized resource and subsequent mapping application as a showcase this fall. And then that resource will be regularly updated via an API and available for anyone else who is looking to use it. So Node really acted as that final grounding tether to be able to link street routes with an established institutional entity beyond just the student group Mapping Action Collective. And Randy Morris from IMS, who has really championed Node's development, he was present at the coffee meetings with street routes, meeting face-to-face and engaging in that collaborative space with all of us all along the way. It was really amazing how beautifully all the pieces came together because we were able to embed that flexibility, respond to the needs of our community partners, and leverage our assets. Next slide. So through this work, the Mapping Action Collective has now incorporated into a 501c3. So we did effectively, build their capacity as well as street routes, which was very, very exciting. Node is up and running and gaining momentum as we speak. Street routes is helping us shape what the final mapping application that pulls the data from our workflow will look like. And PSU is bringing together staff, faculty, students, and community members to integrate resilience into our climate action plan. So what does all this mean for strategy development? This process really established a rapport and a mutually beneficial relationship between Portland State and a community organization that is directly serving the communities that are going to be most affected by climate change. These are folks that are living on the street. They'll be breathing the bad air quality. They'll be sitting in the heat. They're going to be needing resources. And, the city is already falling short in a lot of ways to meet the needs of these communities. So if we're planning on, all of these effects being exacerbated in our future climate change scenarios, we really need to be building upon the organizations already trying to do that work today in order to build their capacity to be able to provide for doing that work in the future. And we are really excited to continue engaging with street routes as we develop these strategies, our resilience strategies, for how Portland State can further foster social resilience in our community. So we now have strong advocates for those most exposed to these increasingly hostile climate effects we are anticipating, in some ways already experiencing. And these advocates can help us figure out how to best serve our campus community moving forward. We will soon have a tool that shows who is working to support a resilient and inclusive community in Portland now, so that they can connect with one another and we can build upon that foundation. And we have an example of how the resilience planning process itself fosters social resilience, simply through the one-on-one as well as institution organizational relationships that we engaged in over the last year. So PSU now has an established expert on social resilience and vulnerability and the needs of vulnerable community members at the planning table. This expert, that is aware of what we have and what we are willing to offer as an educational institution. It is engaged in the resilience planning process and is its own node in this broader network of organizations working to meet our community's basic needs. So it's been a really fascinating, challenging, and rewarding process. Huge thanks to everyone who helped us along the way. And I'm really excited to share, the findings of our strategies in the coming year. So thank you so much. And with that, I'll pass it back to Ruby and look forward to your questions and conversation.
Great. And I'll just jump in, Taya. Go ahead, Ruby.
Oh, no, I was just going to say thanks a lot, Taya and Tina. Those are both very interesting presentations and really great processes on both schools. And I wanted to remind folks on the line to enter any questions you have. So take it away, Ned.
Absolutely. Yes, really wonderful presentations. I was glued to the screen, which I can't say for all webinars, I must say. So great job. I was captivated with your story, Taya, about how you got so deeply engaged in social vulnerability and resilience, which is such an important component of climate resilience, but it's one that I know firsthand that a lot of people doing resilience building outside of the university environment are struggling with how to do it. And I'm joining my question with something that came in over the chat as well, just to ask, what does Portland State get out of this? You articulated very clearly how there was an educational opportunity for some very focused undergraduates who sound like rock stars in their own right. But I'm curious, administratively, what the university sees as a benefit of being so engaged in community resilience building.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And they were graduate students, so just for the record, they were they had a very high skill level. Yeah, that would have been very impressive. Yeah, so very, very good question. So as I'm sure you all have encountered, this resilience process can be kind of messy. You're deciding, what questions you need to be asking, what's appropriate to ask, what's feasible to ask, what's within your scope to ask. And since there are so many unknowns, I really, I can't emphasize enough, the importance of doing as holistic an asset inventory as you can to really see, what everyone has to offer, because none of us are going to be able to tackle this alone. None of us are going to be able to tackle this in a silo. No one's going to be able to fix all the problems on their own. And we just at least have to start with communication with one another, right? Just kind of see who's doing what so that we know where we can fit in. And so that's why I, really found the asset inventory process really essential, and just kind of starting with this nitty-gritty inventory of social service providers, so that we can, rather than Portland State, tasking itself with meeting all of the needs of, the extent that we determine our campus community is, we are now able to be like, okay, these are the needs of our community, and these are all the folks working to do it. So it's kind of like simultaneously distributing the burdens and, kind of, building that, that responsibility to all kind of work together to meet these needs. So even if it kind of sounds like, maybe we're like building all these strategies that Portland State is now going to, check all these things for all the needs of these vulnerable communities, it's really opening the doors to be able to be like, okay, well, these people are working on this already. How can we partner with them to kind of build them up? And how can we, leverage what we have to help facilitate that process? So, even if, Portland State's not going to be the one to be providing emergency food rations to all of downtown Portland during an earthquake, we can leverage our, our knowledge base, our, informational sharing resources, our communication mechanisms, our networks to kind of connect the folks that would be working in those arenas, and then kind of talk to them to be like, okay, how could we plug in? How could we be of help? Building upon that work that you're already doing.
So is it fair to say that the Street Roots effort helped you focus your own capacity to do that kind of leveraging, because it identified what existed? When you said holistic asset inventory, it sounded like you had a big leg up community-wide with that Street Roots report.
Right, yeah. It actually really helps you scope in, what's actually feasible for your university to address. You can kind of have a larger awareness of who else is working in similar capacities.
So I'd like to turn that lens around and ask Tina a question, because in Medford, in your community resilience building process that you took from Adam Welchel and the Nature Conservancy, I'm wondering how much work you did, Tina, with your team prior to the workshop to put the process on track and define relevant issues, because getting the conversation started can be such an important barrier to overcome. And as Taya pointed out, having something to start with is really helpful. Now, this is kind of inverting the paradigm, because you're going out and including the community in your university process. So what did you have to do to get people focusing from the get-go on how to prioritize vulnerabilities and risks?
So that's a good question. I think actually Ruby might be better situated to answer this, because basically Adam, well, first of all, we really were able to leapfrog a few things by having the hazard mitigation plan and the THERA already identify the top 4 risks, because a lot of entities have to spend time sort of sorting that out for themselves, but we already had that. But then when Adam came in, he brought facilitators in who facilitated these small group discussions, and Ruby was one of them, but I actually didn't participate. So Ruby, do you want to speak for a second on how you guys got the participants to prioritize?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's kind of a good point to include here that doing having a successful workshop and having these great outcomes, it can happen in a day, but there's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes into making it successful. And I think that's, that's something that universities are doing really well. And it takes a lot of time to identify the right people to get in the room to, think about who are the leaders and who are the stakeholders that need to be present and what groups need to be represented, and who are the key people both on campus and in the community that need to be there. And then building those relationships and having the trust to be able to get the folks in the room. The process of going through the workshop, it's, I definitely suggest folks check out the Community Resilience Building website for the process. It's a very structured workshop, and what we do is that, we're trying to elicit as many responses from the community or from the campus, the participants of the workshop, as possible, so that it really is kind of a bottom-up grassroots approach to identifying what some of the key priorities and what's most important to the campus and to the community. So we ask folks to first go through and identify all of the assets that they can identify both on campus and the community. And so we take some time doing that. And then based on the climate hazards that in Tufts' case were already identified from the Hazard Mitigation Plan, we asked the participants to think through how each of those hazards might impact the assets that they had listed. And because folks are, spending time themselves kind of identifying this and thinking through how the potential climate impacts could affect the hazard or the assets that they see in the community, we really see people taking more ownership over that. And then the final step is, asking people to brainstorm, well, okay, so if this is a potential impact from climate to the assets that you've identified, what can we do about it? And so that's where all these potential action steps are generated. And then finally, the prioritization that you mentioned, that's kind of, well, if we have limited resources, asking people to go through and identify, well, what do we need to do first? What's high priority? And what do we need to do in the short term versus actions that are going to be done more over a, longer, maybe 5 to 10 year time frame. There are some that are very acute and need to be addressed, in the next year or so, and then some that are kind of more long-term goals. So that's kind of a windy answer to the question.
It's an excellent answer, and it's a very clear example of going back to our first webinar, going through steps 1 and 2. So exploring the hazards happened through the THERA and hazard mitigation planning processes, and you brought that into the workshop and did your prioritization of vulnerabilities and risks. So to me, that just seemed like a very clear example of moving through steps 1 and 2, and I think you're ready to look at options based on your high priority risk. So having said that, I'm also curious, as was another audience member, what did Tufts see as the primary benefit of going through this process? You certainly mentioned a potential downside of maybe one campus not wanting to hear from the other campus on how it should run its facility. But Tina, you mentioned your boss compelled people to actually attend and participate in the workshop. So really, what's in it for Tufts to go through this extra work? I mean, indeed, you had to go for funding to augment your existing hazard mitigation planning process?
Well, I think Ruby will be happy to hear this, but I was able to leverage our climate commitment that the president signed. So I was sort of pushing the deadline, saying, hey, we have to submit to Second Nature, because we said we would, a climate resiliency report, and we don't have anything. And here's this great sort of free opportunity, and we have students that are willing to help out. We have an organization that's willing to help out, and we need to do it sort of now, because we have to turn in our thing now. So I think that really helped, just having a deadline there. And then one of the things that so my boss did come to like the report out and talk to some people about their experience. And one of the things that people ended up going away with feeling good about is that they were able to talk to, and this sustainability does this all the time, but they were able to talk to people that are never in the room together. And that's one thing that she repeated many different opportunities when she talked about the workshop, is this is a group of people that never get together. You never have people from all these different ranges in the same room. And so it's really this great opportunity to sort of create connections across the university. And as anyone knows who works at a university, communication can sometimes be a challenge, like internal communication. And so people really enjoyed being able to meet people from other departments and learn about what other departments were doing. And that she really saw that as a big benefit as well, that wasn't necessarily planned for. Did that answer your question?
Excellent. It sure did. In a surprise, really, that that climate resilience building could be an incentive for us to learn to communicate better across department lines. And I mean, the role of universities in being open places for communication and places where people talk about issues across disciplines, I think, is an idea that is going to be revived strongly this century. But that's just me opining. I have a question from someone in the audience for both of you, and we'll start with Taya. You've built a strong relationship and a platform that you're going to launch, and you told us that that's coming up in the future. We're curious, folks are curious, what will be the next step once you have this geospatial platform for finding services? How do you see this work continuing?
Yeah, so one thing, the Node platform is up and running. So that's live, that's working. It just came out in, I believe, February or so. So it's pretty recent, but it's trucking along, doing a great job. We're getting a lot of stuff, a lot of good traffic there. And then we do have the data available. We're doing a little troubleshooting, and then we'll be developing our mapping application in October. So that should be coming up in the fall, just for that timeline. So where we're kind of moving from here is we're really, launching right into our strategy development process. So kind of using the capacity assessment pieces we did during the CRUX grant to influence our strategy. So it kind of gives us the foundation for the contacts that we want involved in workshops and working groups around natural systems, social systems, and infrastructure in the built environment, around resilience in those three categories. So it kind of gave us the foundation to build those working groups around. Definitely got, the word about resilience and resilience planning kind of percolating throughout campus and surrounding community to a degree. And moving forward, as far as our strategy development, I'm really excited to, keep Street Roots as, our main expert on social vulnerability and the needs of the community and who else is doing this work in the community. As we kind of develop our social resilience strategies specifically. And then also, kind of continuing to use these data sharing platforms as a way to facilitate, continuing to break down silos, identify gaps, really just having that geographic presentation of folks, working in these different kind of arenas. It's a perfect tool for doing a gap analysis of our needs moving forward. We're also looking at, what other asset layers would be really helpful, specifically to climate resilience. So we're able to look at, our climate risks mapped out for the Portland metro area. Primarily we're looking at, heat and stormwater flooding. And so we have that mapped out for the Portland metro area. Now we can overlay that with social vulnerability indicators, which we also have. The climatecope.org/second nature tool kind of visualizes both of that. And so we're looking to kind of couple that with this community asset map to look again, at the gap analysis of okay, where are vulnerable communities? Where do they have the services they need? Where are we definitely lacking? Where do we need to focus efforts? And what organizations can we kind of call and engage with to start to address those gaps? So yeah, it's that'll both influence our university strategy as well as just kind of continue to facilitate the relationship that we do have with the city and the county and their climate change preparation strategies around kind of figuring out, how can we all kind of do our part to make the future a little bit more comfortable for everybody, especially our most vulnerable.
Well, that's the second major props I've heard for second nature helping keep processes move along. I mean, Tina mentioned how just this president's commitment helped keep her process moving forward, and then you mentioned that the Crux grant is keeping people focused on moving ahead. So, way to go, Ruby. Tina, what do you see as the next step? As I said, it seemed to me that you had moved through the first two steps and the steps to resilience, which is the framework we have, and to me it would be you're ready to look at options for increasing resilience. What do you see as your next steps?
Yeah, so that spreadsheet that I mentioned, so that's our next thing is we want to get feedback on the priorities on the different priority recommendations from the departments that would be impacted by that, and then sort of get we plan on presenting that to the senior administration, and then my hope at least is that then it will become part of that department's sort of responsibility. So like their performance, they can include that in their planning for the next year, or like their whatever planning they're doing. They could be like, okay, this is something that we should include because our senior administrations are saying it's important, but also hopefully because they participated in the project, in the workshop, that they also see the value of it. So that's what I'm hoping will happen with it.
Could you kind of augment? We were talking before the webinar began a little bit about planning and how the resilience component can maybe shine a light on something that people are already doing, but maybe in a different way. So if people do bring the work you've done into their planning, how might that influence their lens they're using to look at that, or maybe the decision they ultimately make?
Yeah, I think there's real power in bringing people together with their peers and others to sort of, like, when you have all those people in a room together, the folks say that work in capital planning, like they can't help but be like, hey, this is a real thing, like this resiliency thing is a real thing that I should be thinking about, which is, I feel like it's just much more effective for people to think and learn about it in a larger context where everyone's taking it seriously than if I were to just walk into their office and be like, hey, because I actually did this. I was in a meeting for a building like several years ago, being like, we should plan for climate change, and they're like, yeah, if it's efficient, it's already planned for, and so so that my hope is that having people, like just the individual, we were very specific about which individuals we invited to, so having those individuals there, they will actually, bring that knowledge back to what they're doing and think about it when they're like in meetings around like what kind of building should we make. And I've seen that happen. There's another building that they're hoping to make with a donor, and donor is sort of pushing them to go in a direction, and that isn't necessarily the most efficient or resilient, and I've I can hear them talking about like pushing back against this donor, being like, we actually really want to build a building that's going to last for a long time. That's really important to us. And I feel like having the resilience workshop where people had that discussion helped maybe crystallize that or solidify that in their mind, that like this is something that's really important and we really can't ignore it if we want this university to be around. We need, we need to find a way to, to have class when it's 90 degrees out every day, and our buildings aren't air conditioned, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So you're both moving toward implementation phases in various ways. Have you given thought to how you might measure success over time? This is a question that I think in the broader resilience space outside of universities as well, people are thinking about, well, what do we measure? We're dealing with phenomena that are not matching historical climate. So how do we know if we've been successful? So to the extent you've thought about that, do you have any sense of what to measure to get success over time?
I feel, this is Tina. I feel like one measure of success that'll be really easy to measure is business continuity. Like, are we able to still have classes, when there's adverse weather events or during like heat waves? And are people able to actually get their work done? I feel like that's pretty easy to measure. Like, but I'll let Taya respond.
Yeah, I think that, I think it's a great, hits the nail on the head there, Tina, about just, are we able to function as a university? Are we able to make education accessible? Are we able to keep the lights on, keep the doors open, hold classes where, folks aren't sweltering in the heat? That's definitely, our primary one. And then we do have at Portland State, we've kind of gone into developing a number of different indicators around, building operations and capacities around, water and heat primarily. A number of different measures to kind of look at, how much progress we're making in these different arenas. But I mean, of course, it is kind of frustrating. Resilience can be kind of more ambiguous in some of those indicators. So it is, there's more qualitative things beyond that. But there are ways to kind of ground those measures in, days classes were canceled, attendance levels, retention levels. Are we just able to fulfill the role of a university within these effects? And then beyond that, are we doing that as, a bunker, or are we doing that as, a resource for the surrounding community as well?
Yeah, interesting. Are you familiar, are either of you familiar with a Harvard effort to their meta leadership process? Are you familiar with that, for maximizing resources to connect people to support services? And if not, someone suggests maybe looking at that.
What is it? Can you say it again?
It's a Harvard University apparently has what I'm reading here is meta leadership process, and apparently it's designed to maximize resources to connect people to support services.
I am not familiar with that, but thanks.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you both so much for just a really enriching conversation, and you're sharing your experience. I think that other schools and universities are going to find this very applicable, relevant, and inspiring. So I really appreciate the opportunity to participate and everyone's time for joining this webinar today. Ruby, I'll pass it back to you for some final words.
Great. I just want to say a big thank you to the panelists and to Ned for working on this webinar with us, and thanks to all the participants who joined. Excuse me, who joined. We'll post the recording on our website and let you know when it's up. And in the meantime, definitely don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.